Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to What Is It About Warhol That? So I'm Donna DeSalvo. I'm Deputy Director for International Initiative, Senior Curator, and one of the curators of the Andy Warhol Retrospective. This is our last program in a series of public programs that have been organized by my distinguished colleague, Megan Hoyer, Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement, working along also with Izzy Dow and the whole team in our education department. And we've had, an amazing run of programs that really have, I hope, have continually unpacked the questions about this most enigmatic figure, who will probably continue to be unpacked. So we'll have some unpacking tonight, and we're very excited to have the participants here. The Warhol exhibition will be closing on March 31st, so it's hard to believe, but there are 16 days left for you to get your fix of Andy Warhol. And so I think, it's a very fitting question to ask. And, after all these years of Warhol's death, which is more than 3 decades, and all that we know about Warhol and his influence, I think there's still so much more to be known, both positive and negative. And I think one of the questions that's being asked is, how Warhol, and I'll just read what we've put out there, infiltrates art making now, and his complicated legacy as an artist, a filmmaker, cultural icon, philosopher, queer outlaw, and more. I think no doubt Warhol has put forward different propositions of how an artist can function in contemporary society. So I think I'm very excited because it is a question that gets asked over and over again. But I think now with this perspective of many years have gone by and a different generation even coming to Warhol, many of whom were not alive in 1989 when there was the last Warhol retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, I think that it's a kind of great opportunity to ask some of these questions. So we're very excited this evening to have 4 wonderful individuals, plus Lynne Tillman, an equally wonderful individual, who will take us through. So you don't want to hear me because I've said what needs to be said in the show, and I want to call out Mark Loakina, who's on the Warhol team, Christy Mitchell, who's not here, Lauren Young, but it was very team Warhol to really mount this extraordinary, we think, extraordinary exhibition, and hopefully one that gets deeper into the surface of Warhol. So I'm going to introduce people in the order in which they are actually going to speak. Justine Kurland is a photographer known for her utopian images of American landscapes and the fringe communities, both real and imagined, that inhabit them. Her work has been exhibited extensively at museums and galleries in the United States and abroad, and is included in the permanent collection of the Whitney, among many others. Her recent gallery exhibitions include Girl Pictures, 1997 to 2002, at Mitchell, Innish, and Nash in New York, Airless Spaces at Higher Pictures, New York, and The Open Road, Photography and the American Road Trip at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Kurland currently teaches at Parsons School of Design. Justine will following Justine will be Leigh Ledare, who creates work that raises questions of agency, intimacy, and consent, transforming the observer into the voyeur of private scenes or situations dealing with social taboos. Using photography, the archive, language, and film, he explores notions of subjectivity in a performative dimension. His interventions putting in tension the realities of social constructions and the projective assumptions that surround them. Ledare's work has been shown in solo exhibitions at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Box Gallery in Los Angeles, Office Baroque Gallery in Brussels, Manifesta 11 in Zurich, and more. He's held teaching positions at various universities, including Yale University, the California Institute of the Arts, Columbia University, NYU, and the Fondazione Spinola Bonaparte Arte in Italy. Next will be Cy Gavin, who's an artist based in New York. His recent solo exhibitions include presentations at Gavin Brown's Enterprise, New York, VNH Gallery in Paris, and Sargent's Daughters in New York. don't want to leave that out. Group exhibitions include Lure of the Dark at Mass MoCA, Between the Waters at the Whitney, we're very happy about that, as well as shows at Participant, Barbara Gladstone Gallery, and the UTA Artist Space in Los Angeles. A solo, I hope that was UTA, not UTA. Either way, okay, all right. A solo exhibition of recent paintings by Gavin is currently on view at Gavin Brown's Enterprise. That's up at 127th Street through April 14th. Elizabeth Schambelan is deputy editor at Art Forum and has published reviews and essays in publications, including Art Forum, Book Forum, the LA Review of Books, and N+1 magazine. Schambelan's extensive contributions to Art Forum date back to 2002. Recent pieces include Hell is for Children, editor's letter in the September 2018 issue of Art Forum, in which she explores themes of propaganda and terror in the landscape of American art and politics. For the winter 2019 issue of N+1 magazine, Schambelan supplied an essay, thank you, on Brett Kavanaugh and the history of sexual violence titled Everybody Knows. That's a good title. So I also want to thank Lynne Tillman for agreeing to moderate this conversation, and for the artists and individuals that she's invited, because I think this is going to be a lively thing. And I am a huge fan of Lynne, and I know that this is going to be a very rich conversation. So Lynne Tillman is a novelist, short story writer, and cultural critic. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship and an Andy Warhol Creative Capital Arts Writing Fellowship. Currently, Lynne is professor, writer-in-residence in the Department of English at the University of Albany and teaches at the School of Visual Arts, Art Criticism, and Writing MFA program in New York. Her most recent books include The Complete Madame Realism and Other Stories, 2016, Men and Apparitions, 2018, and the new edition of her 2006 novel, American Genius, a Comedy, 2019. The re-release of the latter comes more than a decade after its first publication in 2006. Since then, American Genius, a Comedy, has been cemented into the canon of contemporary classics, often described as a, quote, masterpiece, and included in Vulture's 100 Best Books of the 21st Century. I can think of no one better to take us down this road and ask the question, what is it about Warhol that, than Lynne Tillman. Please join me in welcoming Lynne.
I'm very excited to have been able to bring this group together. And I also want to say that I think Donna's curation of this exhibition of Warhol is just spectacular and very, very important. I'm just going to say a very few words. I'd been worrying about how to discuss Warhol, and then I realized that Warhol was a problem. So I looked up problem in the dictionary. I often look things up in the dictionary, and even words I think I know. And the first meaning is that a problem is something unwanted. So I thought, well, you know, Warhol was unwanted, and he still is by some, and he's very much wanted by others. So I became very interested in the effect that he has now, because I know the effect that he had on me when I was a teenager first seeing that work, and I don't really need to think about that effect on me so much. I want to know how his work is being, entering the contemporary mind. And so I'm very, very happy to have this group, these four people together. And the first person to speak will be Justine Kurland. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for having me here. And thanks, Donna, for your introduction. I also teach at ICP Bar. There's some people I just have to represent. Anyway. The girl I loved in high school, Nikki Rosenthal, loved Andy Warhol. Her obsession may have stemmed from his uncanny resemblance to her own controlling and emotionally unavailable mother. Like Warhol, they both had an eccentric relationship to the telephone and shopping. Nikki was a blonde Jewish girl. Her perpetually tanned skin was silky to the touch, and her voice rasped from cigarettes and marijuana. I was attracted to her private school self-confidence, completely foreign and exotic to me. Her family lived in a Classic 7, a doorman building on the Upper East Side where I spent as much time as possible. I made my first photograph there, a portrait of Nikki with her Nikon F3, the camera I eventually bought so I could be more like her. We wrote stories together, describing screams of mating cats in nighttime alleys, and she read aloud to me from Andy Warhol's The Philosophy of Andy Warhol, the sections about dieting and sex. I fixated on Edie Sedgwick, triangulating my erotic attachment to Nikki through Edie's anorexic, androgynous form. I borrowed Nikki's copy of Edie by Jean Stein and pored over the gossipy details of Edie's spectacular life. In photographs, she appears the mirror of Warhol, with silver hair and a striped shirt, more mannequin than person, so thin her black tights stretch opaquely. Nikki sometimes dressed me up in her clothing, a Betsy Johnson miniskirt or a Dayglow t-shirt from Fiorucci. We would stand side by side in front of her closet's full-length mirror, teenagers dressed up with nowhere to go. Nikki ended up going to Brown University and got into the Grateful Dead. I found a waitressing job and moved to the East Village. I wanted this to be a love letter to Nikki, to thank her for giving me photography, but I find myself thinking about Edie instead. In John Palmer and David Wiseman's film Chow Manhattan, Edie essentially plays herself as the strung-out actress Susan Superstar. She glam camps in a drained swimming pool and spends most of the film on her back with her shirt off, occasionally getting up to dance only to fall back down again. Her dancing performs the same stuttering motion as her body during the electroshock therapy. Edie/Susan's disembodied voice slurs narration over flashback sequences, actual documentary footage from her days at the factory. She speaks with dissociative fascination about her drug addiction and lack of control, as if she were already dead, and enjoys revisiting the spectacle. A thin, incoherent storyline about a drifter named Butch and an evil millionaire ameliorates what is otherwise Edie's snuff film. Script and real life collapse in a final scene when a newspaper headline announces the suicide of Edie, not Susan. The way those sons of bitches took advantage of me, Edie is quoted as saying in Stein's biography. Here is psychoanalyst Robert Linder describing electric shock therapy in 1952. In order to bring about the desired quiet and submissiveness, the patient is put through a crucifixion of such torment as one would wish to spare the lowliest animals. In fact, the idea for electroshock therapy originated when Ugo Sarletti, an Italian neurologist, observed a butcher giving electric shocks to pigs. The animals became docile and in their coma-like state were easily led to slaughter. Sarletti patented this procedure in 1938. Ever since, it has been disproportionately used against women, and in the 60s was a popular treatment for eccentrics, depressives, radicals, or simply used as a punitive measure in overcrowded facilities. In 1968, oh no, that's the first slide. Was it not on the timer? Oh, I have to advance it. I thought it was going to do it for me. Okay, whatever. It's very loose connection anyway. This is just the work I've been making lately. I thought I would show you. But I want to get back to my Edie. in 1968, Edie Sedgwick was coincidentally a fellow inmate with Valerie Solanas at Mattawan State Hospital, an institution with such an atrocious record of human rights violations, where experimental surgeries, straitjackets, and shock therapy were routine procedures that it was forced to close in 1977. As Lynne Tillman has written, inventions have a dark side, examples mount daily, even ones formulated to produce artificial light. Warhol first depicted the electric chair in 1963, the same year New York State banned capital punishment, reinstating it in 1997. He sourced his image of the chair from Sing Sing State Penitentiary, the site of the last 2 executions. Ruth Brown Snyder sat in Warhol's chair in 1927 for the murder of her husband. She was photographed by Tom Howard, the first ever documentation of a death by electrocution. Warhol's serial production of electric chairs continued into the 70s. A purposeful or perhaps gratuitous repetition that either empties out or increases the horror of the image depending on how you look at it. The perceived glamour of the factory, where Warhol's assistants would crank out endless silk screens for their auteur master, stands in stark contrast to the crude DIY production of Valerie Solanas' Scum Manifesto, which she mimeographed and sold for change on street corners. I like thinking about Ruth Brown Snyder because in killing her husband, she challenges the notion that women are only ever the recipients of violence. The history of art is full of examples of men abusing women. Pablo Picasso and Ike Turner beat their wives. Norman Mailer stabbed his wife in the back and chest. And Carl Andre, while never convicted, probably pushed his wife of 8 months on a Mondietta out of a 34th floor window. Also unindicted, Thomas Romo recently received public recognition for serially raping his female students. Women are much better at being cruel to themselves. Virginia Woolf drowned herself, Diane Arbus slit her wrists, Francesca Woodman jumped to her death, and the method of suicide used by Chantal Akerman was never disclosed, while Kate Spade's suicide letter was published. It read in part, "Ask Daddy." Valerie Solanas waged war on Daddy's girls in her Scum Manifesto, those nice, passive, accepting, cultivated, polite, dignified, subdued, dependent, scared, mindless, insecure, approval-seeking Daddy's girls who can't cope with the unknown, who want to hang back with apes, who feel secure only with Big Daddy standing by, with a big, strong man to lean on, with a fat, hairy face in the White House, who are too cowardly to face up with the hideous reality of what a man is, what Daddy is. The manifesto called for an end to men and the power that seeks domination, exploitation, death, and the creation of a superior, all-female society. I've tried to visualize that society in my photographs. Here are some other things I know about Valerie Solanas. She was a revolutionary, a panhandler, prostitute, and vagabond, insane, brilliant, and very funny. Her Scum Manifesto was the first radical feminist text 3 years before Shulamith Firestone's Dialectics of Sex and Kate Millett's Sexual Politics. Valerie didn't shoot Andy Warhol because he was a man. She shot him because he stole her work, the typescript for her play Up Your Ass. In June 1968, convinced that her publisher, Maurice Gerodius, was conspiring with Warhol, she went to his office to kill him first, but he was out of town. She then went to Warhol's studio, where she shot Warhol and one of his assistants. Gerodius printed Scum Manifesto 3 days after the shooting, but never paid Valerie any royalties. The Warhol Foundation continues to hold her stolen script, Up Your Ass, in its archives. Valerie had 2 children, probably from being raped by her father before she was 15. Her uterus was removed without consent during her incarceration. The mental institutions broke her. At the end of her life, she continuously stabbed herself with a fork and cawed like a bird. She was covered with sores. She died alone of pneumonia in a welfare hotel in San Francisco in 1988. Her mother burned her unpublished manuscripts because she wanted Valerie to rest in peace. This final silencing is an insult to Valerie's life's work. The dead come back all tore up. The year Valerie died, I graduated from high school and moved to a sublet in the East Village. It's the same neighborhood where I still live, where Edie holed up to shoot speed after her break from Warhol, and where Valerie prowled the streets selling her manifestos, $1 for men, 50 cents for women. I arrived during the summer of the Tompkins Square Park riots to protesters chanting, "Die, yuppie scum." But the scum of gentrifiers, the secretion of their privilege, wholly differs from feminist scum, which arises as the residue of female genius up out of the gutters of marginalization and cries from society's garbage dumps. After Valerie shot Warhol, she walked from Union Square to Times Square and turned herself over to a rookie cop on the beat. She told him, "The police are looking for me. They want me. He had too much control over my life," and handed over a .32 automatic and a .22 revolver. Another gun was recovered at the scene inside of a brown paper bag on Warhol's desk that also contained a maxi pad. Valerie was taken to the 13th precinct for booking. A battery of photographers were already waiting. When asked, she told reporters, "I live nowhere. I come from the river," and then added, "Read my manifesto if you want to know what I am." Andy Warhol's work is compelling because it's the result of a damaged psyche, one that caused great pain to his collaborators. Taylor Mead, the star of Warhol's film Taylor Mead's Ass, has said that if Valerie hadn't shot Andy, he might have. I want to honor Edie Sedgwick and Valerie Solanas' madness. I envision Valerie's rage and Edie's despair as opposite ends of a spectrum of possible responses to male supremacy. I wanted Valerie to save Edie somehow, but how could she? They were, in too many respects, the same. In reimagining the story, I would play Valerie to Nikki's Edie, and this time things would be different. Together, we would realize Valerie Solanas' mandate for art. The true artist is every self-confident, healthy female. And in a female society, the only art and the only culture will be conceited, kooky, funky females grooving on each other and everything else in the universe. Thank you.
Okay, just a little disclaimer. This is just titled, "What Isn't It About Andy Warhol?" So I set out to move briefly through some of the distinct scales of how personification of the media, receivership, and the socialism medium are entangled in Warhol's work. Clearly, Warhol embodies a parasitic Clearly, Warhol embodies and parasites existing systems, particularly the logics of the media and spectacle. How I'm most interested in seeing this is, one, as an investigation or reflection around how we are organized as subjects through technology, and two, how we use technology in turn, both to organize the social and our relations to one another within the social. That said, at this current moment, this text is both unfinished and somewhat of a mess. To begin with a quote from the philosophy of Andy Warhol, From A to B and Back Again. "Some critics called me the Nothingness himself, and that didn't help my sense of existence any. Then I realized that existence itself is nothing, and I felt better, but I'm still obsessed with the idea of looking into the mirror and seeing no one, nothing." In the space of 3 sentences, this quote articulates a set of expectations, then playfully disarticulates and returns them in vampiric guise. Perhaps like no one else, Warhol's affectless, screen-like self-presentation effaced expectations of artistic authenticity and identity. Refusing to announce a fixed position from which to read his work, Warhol's commentary constantly throws the job of finding one's footing back on the viewer. How does this persona, paradoxically a kind of non-individual individualism, operate not only to bad-foot the viewer, but in doing so to reveal our assumptions about Warhol himself, both as a product of culture as well as a producer? As the social systems theorist Nicholas Luhmann observed, what culture produces is operations which further reproduce culture. This autopoiesis, or the notion that systems self-reproduce, helps in understanding something elemental to how Warhol's work communicates, something inextricably coupled to his lacuna-like vacuity. While Warhol allows a tremendous amount of indeterminacy into his work, at the same time he introduces glitches into the system. While much can be said about Warhol's humor, and it often carries a cruelty that can be mercilessly hollowing out, I see it as far from cynical. Rather, Warhol is an acutely curious gatherer of information, a mapmaker of our spectacle condition. He mines this data in a number of ways. One, through willfully offering himself up as a screen for projections, and by following Warhol's nose to where and how he intervenes in culture and how culture responds, deep insight can be gleaned not only about Warhol's patterns of thought, his anxieties and inclinations, but also our own. And two, through something akin to what Kaja Silverman has described as heteropathic identification. Rather than forcefully asserting his ego over the other, I see Warhol as handing over his ego to the other as a space to explore, allowing others to occupy and move through him as a medium. The amateurism of Warhol's film work suspend this incidental quality of liveness, what I believe Douglas Crimp once described as the failure to perform as performance. In much the same way, Warhol suspends himself there as a mirror, occupying a position that is simultaneously host, guest, and parasite. At once about everything and nothing, his films speak both to consumption, appropriation, and production of media, and also production of the social, as well as his attempts to reconceive himself as a medium. To reduce Warhol's persona to an act or something mechanistic and stripped of affect is cynical itself towards the effects that persona produce. For that reason, I want to emphasize Warhol's function as a container, one whose meaning, like the media, is on one hand contingent upon the charisma of his impersonality, but also constituently resonant. That is to say, it is only through the pressure of the encounter, in other words, from being in relation to others and to each other, that each subject might come to know her or himself in depth. Warhol's vacuity, both as a subject and an image, presents us with a kind of icon mirage. Warhol forces us to contend with this conundrum, mirroring back to us our own fetishistic investments. His no one in the mirror reveals a paradoxical condition. What comprises an infinity of meaning may at the same time double as an abyss of meaning. Nonetheless, we have to look at the actual complexity of projections and associations that hang over Warhol, how these parts are in fact held by us. He was at once his wig, a machine, openly queer, Catholic, of Czech descent, a celebrity, locus of downtown activity, a gunshot victim, manipulative, ineffectual, beloved, both authentic and unabashedly inauthentic, ambitious, generous, and hoarding. Chock full of contradictions, this laundry list is as much about him as a subject as it is about us and about culture. The container is anything but empty. Connecting this to interests within my own recent work, in the 1950s, Welford Beyond, a psychoanalyst at the Tavistock Institute in London, developed an experiential systems-based method to study the unconscious social dynamics of groups, specifically dynamics having to do with authority relationships, projective identification, and transference. Countering typical narratives of exposure, Beyond described his method's aim as being to shine onto social relations a black beam, the reciprocal of a searchlight. Enacting a temporary institution whose sole purpose is to study itself and its emergent behavior, the collective membership, participants and psychologists alike, import themselves into the abstract container of the conference. Along with themselves, they all import their specific identities, psychological valences, and proclivity to role, not to mention all of the social baggage they inevitably drag with them. Structured through a precise system of restraints designed to surface the group's regression, this feedback machine reveals the social contradictions, dysfunction, and assumptions that inhibit the group, traits such as dependency, fight and flight, pairing, non-differentiation, or splitting. Not therapy, the psychologists who consult to the group occupy a kind of Brechtian distance, a role not unlike Warhol's, which, functioning as persona, recasts the typical dependency relationship of therapist-patient to be one of management and workers. The question becomes, how do the workers want to use the management? Serving as a foil, this allows participants to reflect on how the roles they take up within the group actively or passively open onto a social field, itself a matrix whose meanings are wholly contingent, not only upon position, but also relationships, beliefs, psychic investments, etc. I connect this back to Warhol in that his practice similarly comprises a system, a recursive feedback machine that sets the dynamic conditions for a complex, multivalent mapping of the social. In particular, he frames this through our cultural fascinations with the media and spectacle. If the more socially oriented aspects of the factory's production set out to frame populations of people, and I'm compelled to borrow this social lens from the Tavistock to look at another facet of Warhol's production, to suggest that within the disaster series, Warhol situates the viewer not amidst populations of people, but rather populations of images. And with all of this, all the complex cultural trauma that these images suggest. Carefully chosen and orchestrated to carry a kind of counterpointing set of differences, which enact a figure-ground reversal, these poignantly insert us into a system of viewing, an immersive matrix where we are implicated amidst and between a series of contradictions and problematics about the American psyche. I'll leave it at that, as it is unfinished, and yeah, hopefully it spurns some conversation. Thanks.
Hi. Well, first of all, I want to say that when Lynn approached me to think about the topic, I was sort of inundated with ideas because I have thought about Warhol my whole life. I grew up around Pittsburgh and sort of really like in the shadow of Warhol because I was 15 whenever they made the Warhol Museum. And I was there, and it was a sort of lifeline to contemporary art for Pittsburgh in a way. Although, of course, there's the Carnegie International. There weren't conversations around art that was happening in America and in the world, really until that space and the Mattress Factory started doing lecture series and bringing people in. That being said, I also had painted for my whole life, like since I was a young teenager. And was fascinated by Warhol's, I was fascinated by Warhol's ability to shapeshift, and of course then my understanding of his work wasn't freighted with a sort of understanding of a market and what sort of pushback he may have gotten in making those sorts of changes that disavowed the work he had done before. But to me it seemed really liberating, really bizarre to be in a place like Pittsburgh, which has, and surely had when he was there, very conservative and intolerant views towards, say, homosexuals, but also anyone who's not doing something with their hands, like actually like involved in labor or, yeah. So where I grew up was part of the Rust Belt, so the idea of going to an art school was as ridiculous probably when I was in the mid-2000s as it was in the 50s. But the one thing I wanted to talk about, which has always sort of haunted me or has been something in my brain around Warhol, is his use of shadow. But I also realized that there was some programming that was about that very thing, and I started thinking about that before I realized that, which was, but I'm going somewhere else, I hope, with it. My interest has been there because I remember being a child and seeing Empire and seeing having on my wall like they have a workshop in that museum where you can make your own screen prints, and there was a electric chair, and just the presence of a shadow was really, and kind of the blown out quality of those images was really kind of arresting to me, because I thought that the shadows were modulated and so thoughtful that they had a kind of presence that was maybe more interesting than the actual object that was being illuminated. And now, as someone who's painting a lot and thinking about shadows and thinking about light, I'm working mostly with figuration, but also sort of edging and dancing around abstraction as a way of getting closer to something that feels realer than actually dutifully presenting something. My my interest in his use of shadow has just kind of grown and become more complex, being more exposed to more things he's made. I went to the same school, so I went to Carnegie Mellon, which was strangely very quiet about him having been there, and but the students, knowing that he had gone to that school, really grappled with that. Like, they felt that they had to sort of outdo Warhol, which made no sense considering the timing and everything that has happened since then. But I think because of that and because of my proximity to Warhol's death, actually, like, I didn't have that awareness, and I didn't feel limited by my admiration for certain parts of his practice, and I didn't feel that I had to reinvent them, and I didn't feel like I had to beat them or match them or something. And so, for the most part, I looked at Warhol with a certain, like, admiring fascination for not only his work and in his successfully sort of escaping the orbit of Pittsburgh, which is so livable that no one wants to leave, and because you get sort of bullied into staying there. People feel betrayed. They really do. But I found it really fascinating. You know, I come from a family that is also fundamentalist Christian, and me going into those spaces, like going into, say, see John Waters talk at the Warhol, or something along those lines, seeing my father sort of like pucker and grit his teeth at the prospect of that, but also sort of having to just go along with it because it was just art. I saw my father have conversations with a security guard there as he was waiting for my sister and myself, and the security guard was relaying to him all these stories of, like, anecdotes that he must have read somewhere, that were really tawdry. And I just noticed my father really paying attention and, like, curious, which was fascinating to me, that somehow someone who represented so much that he reviled through his own machinations and fame and reclam had somehow deactivated or like that in the kind of the perversion of America, that was more important to him than his the values that he said he had. And that's actually true for a lot of people in Pittsburgh who might, you know, really hate artists or really hate gay people, but then whenever an international person is in Pittsburgh, they're the first to sort of tout Warhol and tell them where to go and how to get there. And that sort of hypocrisy was really, like, fascinating to me, because I'd never seen someone so inadvertently and nimbly, like, navigate what would seem so inhospitable an environment, posthumously. Then, when I was in school, I encountered an interview with Warhol that I'm just going to excerpt, and I try to give little context so it's not a total misrepresentation.
Right, how do you know which are right?
Well, I don't know. After you finish it, you know whether it's right.
You never try to make it look like life, do you?
Gee, I don't know how.
Do you always choose artificial colours then?
Yeah, I use mostly artificial color. I'm trying to find flesh color, and it's I have so many different flesh colors, but maybe one day I'll get the right flesh color.
Yeah, I wondered then, as I do now, what the right flesh color would be. So, you know, that actually really flew all over me. It still does. Because halftone has been used to represent all kinds of people, not just white people. And so it really made me completely pivot and re-examine the way that I had taken so many things besides Warhol to be universal, or to be about some sort of cosmic experience, or if not, even representative of a smaller group like, say, Americans. And I felt immediately then that I was not part of his audience, and I was also not part of what would have been his raw materials for making the work that alleged to speak to the masses, which was fine, but depressing. So I want to talk about something that I've been thinking about with regard to shadow, and this is not just in response to him, but just maybe help people in painting talk about shadow, and in photography maybe too. I feel like I've always heard about shadow like in relation, sort of like dialectical relation with an object that is, it's a substantiation and like the reification of that object, and proof that it's really there, or that it's really a thing. But it seems reductive to say that about a shadow, because I think that a shadow is more than that, and in fact it's a compounding of not only that, but also whatever object the shadow is being cast upon. And that isn't what can be said for the object that is illuminated. So I've been thinking about painting shadows and how, actually probably because of seeing like Da Vinci's in person or something, like how so few people paint shadows with intention and with substance. And I think that I started deviating away from the planar quality of pop art because I think that it serves a purpose in disseminating ideas and sharing sort of the takeaway of an artwork, but I didn't think that it mandated physically being present to deal with it in the same way that maybe a performance would, or something with music would, or a sculpture would, which would require you to actually understand it spatially. And for all that painting is, it's also, besides an image, a physical thing. And the way that I've been working is, it's largely because of where I used to have my studio. I'd work on the walls, and then when the painting was done, or if I had an opportunity to show it, or if it was good, I would take it off the wall, and it was like an animal hide. It was like a physical thing. That then I would have to make sort of compositional decisions about how I stretched that thing, which were as probably more important than other decisions I made with the composition within it. And so I've been trying to find ways of sort of pushing back against the idea of taking in images like that, like heralding like their reproducibility, and instead favoring a kind of more specific experience of encountering something and dealing with it and bringing something that you are porting to that situation and only you can. And I think maybe that's from being a generation where people had zines and things, where you had to kind of work to actually have an experience, and it wasn't purporting to be egalitarian. It was you were rewarded for your effort and taking an interest. And I think that my interest in that is also in response to Instagram, which is how people take in paintings and art in general like a lot, rather than actually see it. And so I've been thinking about ways of making an experience of seeing a painting in person singular and also completed by the individual who's the onlooker. And so what I've really been thinking about this last year has been shadow. And so the show that I have now up at Gavin Brown's space in Harlem is really about how we see shadows, not just how they're put into culture, but actually like physiologically how you see a shadow and how you see anything actually. So I wanted to talk about just vision and what's happening when we look at something. And I had an experience. I moved my studio upstate in 2016, and it's a barn, it's red. And I'm living for the first time in a place where I don't have artificial light, and there's no street lamps. And I noticed while I was going into the studio one time that the plants that were in front of my studio were still green, it was dusk. And the barn itself was sort of like strange gray. It wasn't a dark, muted red. It was just a kind of like evacuation of color, which freaked me out. I thought it was something wrong with my eyes. So I went online and frantically researched, and in fact, this is something that's called the Perkin effect, or Perkin shift. And I had never noticed it because I've always lived in places where I couldn't. So I felt very grateful for that move, although, I felt grateful for that move because it made me start looking in a different way. So our eyes we have cones and rods, which everyone knows, but there's a moment in our days when if you're in a place where there isn't artificial light, where your eyes have to actually navigate this divide, and it's like a switch, and it's really a matter of signals. So of course animals have a larger breadth of what they can see, and what we perceive is limited to what biologically we've been able to evolve into, which is a diurnal creature. So we have photopic vision, which is what we are dealing with now, or we have artificial illumination in the sun, and then we have scotopic, which is at night, which we don't really use that much now, at least in the United States, which is really letting your eyes have to take in whatever light is there ambiently and making sense of the world that way. The principal differences are that the cone receptors are RGB, and your brain creates illusions of all the other colors with those foundational parts, and that means that any color is really an illusory thing. Of course, it's suspected that it really varies from person to person, but it is actually an illusion of your brain. There isn't a yellow receptor, by the way. Scotopic vision is the rods of your eyes, and that deals with textures and sort of black and white. It doesn't perceive color, but it is more geared in terms of frequency towards blue and green. So I got really fascinated at the phenomenon of having a moonlit night, which was really truly moonlit for the first time in my life, being up there, and I was astonished at how bright the moon was, but also the kind of quality that the atmosphere had because of that light, which is to say that it was bluish. And I started thinking about paintings and representation of darkness, and why, if the sun is a full spectrum light and it's just reflecting off of the moon, why would that light be blue rather than just a diminished version of what we see in the day? And that is because of this phenomenon, which is just us. It's not other animals. So this is a little illustration that I made. Very high tech. So effectively, the red, yellow, and orange just become desaturated, while green and blue are favored and become enhanced. So the work that I'm showing at Gavin's is sort of made to hack that operation in your eyes. So depending on when you go there are skylights. So there are moments in every painting where there's this kind of very complicated arrangement of blues that are only really perceptible when you're in low light. And there's kind of a garish, super spectral orange in a lot of the paintings that, in similar conditions, becomes a much more normal, less abrasive orange. And to this end, I'm thinking about qualities of reproduction that I think Warhol instigated in me when I was a child, which is imagining, it's an offshoot of divisionism or whatever, but actually letting your eyes combine information and make something of that, either through halftone or through arranging small bits of something. And to that end, I've started working with denim, because denim, if you can imagine having hills and dales, I can create effects like that by, say, if I wanted an orange, I could graze the surface of the material with yellow and have the recessed parts be red, or vice versa, or endless permutations of that. And so the next slide is just to contextualize sort of how I've been doing that. This is just this lion I'm wearing. But it's on denim, and I just did a little close-up so you can sort of see how I'm dealing with paint, but also darkness, and how I'm not. These are actually made not using black, so they're just many layers of translucent paint. You get the idea. This is the show. These are all sort of biomorphic spaces that are, as I said, they're made to be seen over time, and actually, you can't really perceive parts of them unless you are there for an extended period of time. I feel like I'm trying to, reinstitute a certain objecthood to a painting, but also make it something that isn't autonomous, that it has to be completed by a viewer, and that it becomes sort of interactive in that way. These are more images of that. So this place, this large painting is sort of the centerpiece of the show. It's this place, Bashbish Falls, and kind of at the border of Massachusetts and New York. And this was on the full lunar eclipse, so the moon was actually kind of orange like that. And I'm still thinking about ways of light being used and how that relates to photography, but also everything in visual arts. Same thing. This is as it looks during the day, but then at various points things come in and out. More. So obviously, part of this has to do with being a brown person who's painting, to me. I mean, that maybe is not obvious, but I had to reckon with myself, how do I operate in a history that is patently European, that is chosen to represent bodies in certain kinds of ways, chosen to make decisions about colors in certain kinds of ways that are exclusionary. And when I was thinking about this, I kept on thinking about Sojourner Truth, who kept on saying, she sold these little visiting cards that said, I saw the shadow to support the substance, and how Black people have worked to, in this country, establish an agency in their own representation in a way that is really important. And for a long time, I didn't show painting because I didn't understand how I could function in a system that so excluded me and people like me. And this is something I'm really just in the last 5 years reevaluating and finding some kind of equity in. But I mean, I've been working on the show for a long time, and I haven't had much else going on in my life, so this is what I have to talk about. There's no thesis. So yeah, thanks.
I thought I would start with one of my favorite Warhol anecdotes, which happens to come from Gene Stein's Edie, an American Biography, an amazing book, and it's formatted as an oral history. So the speaker for this particular anecdote is the legendary curator Henry Geldzahler. Andy was asked to do a radio interview at WBAI, and he asked, "Can I bring a friend along?" So I joined him at the microphone. They would ask a question, and he wouldn't say anything. So I'd lean forward and say, "What Andy means is," and I'd answer it. Once in a while, he'd say yes when the answer was no. Then I'd say, "When Andy says yes, he means no," and then explain. At the end, the interviewer said, "I'd like to thank Mr. Geldzahler from the Metropolitan Museum for being with us today, and Mr. Andy Warhol." Andy grabbed the microphone. It was the first time he spoke more than a monosyllable in the whole interview. He said, "Miss Andy Warhol." Geldzahler doesn't specify the date, but the context suggests that this was 1963 or 1964. In 2014, at the Queen's Museum of Art, there was a fascinating show on Warhol's 13 Most Wanted project for the 1964 World's Fair. And in one of the vitrines, there was correspondence between Warhol and a New York City agency. And the city's letterhead looked as if it had been designed in the 40s. And as I looked at it, I experienced a very pronounced sensation of a kind of gestalt shift, where instead of feeling as if Warhol's breakthrough works of the early 1960s were created at the beginning of the present, the beginning of so much of what we think of as contemporary, they were created in a past that suddenly seemed quite distant. Both of those periodizations are correct, but until seeing that letterhead, I hadn't viscerally felt the truth of the fact that when Warhol was making his first silkscreens and films and creating the factory, the world would have been full of homes and businesses with interiors that had looked the same since the 30s or 40s, and there would be signage all around from the 30s and 40s and so on. No one yet knew in 1964 that they were living in the 60s the way we think of the 60s, but Warhol sort of seemed to somehow know it. In the same Queens Museum show, there was a photograph of a row of Brillo boxes on the floor of the factory, and the effect was very reminiscent of an assembly line. It was an image that burlesqued mass production, underscoring that Warhol's factory produced not utilitarian products, but rather a synergistic array of artworks, films, bands, media, personality, networks, coolness. All of this would eventually fall under the famous rubric business art, but when Warhol said business, he meant specifically the culture industry. He was forecasting the demise of American industrialism and the rise of a different kind of capitalism, one premised on content and intellectual property, and he understood already that for better or worse, this new spirit of capitalism would turn people into brands and life into commodifiable performance. The photograph perfectly captured Warhol's prescience, which seemed supernatural to me in that moment, and sometimes still does, and tends to strike a lot of people that way. But I know that Warhol wasn't clairvoyant, he was just brilliant and radical. For me, situating Warhol in his own present and in relation to his own immediate past helps to make his radicalism palpable and helps me to appreciate that when he grabbed the microphone and said, "Miss Andy Warhol," that was a truly transgressive thing to do. No self-aware self-performance can properly be called Warholian if it lacks the genuine riskiness and the sheer irreducible strangeness of Warhol's self-performance. He wasn't a mirror that simply reflected celebrity culture back at itself. He created all kinds of weird and revealing refractions. The Whitney exhibition helps to conjure the radical Warhol in part by devoting so much space to the artist's early production. The extent to which Warhol's sensibility was indebted to camp is writ large in the gallery that features his commercial work alongside documentation of his playful collaborative vamping with Otto Fenn. One of Warhol's gold shoes is dedicated to Leo Lerman, perhaps the quintessential connoisseur of camp. Another features a pink feather. His gold leaf and pink male nude of 1957 is a hinge between the campy aesthetics of the shoes and his drawings of alluring men in which desire is rendered economically, almost austerely, via a delicate line. Warhol's amazing 1970 sculpture of rolls of iridescent mylar stacked up in a plexiglass case looks nothing like a Warhol. It looks like Donald Judd by way of Isa Genskin. It delivers the aesthetic pleasures of camp's polychrome glitz in a form that satirizes Judd-specific objects, or seems to, the way that the dance diagrams seem to satirize action painting. Something similar seems to occur in Warhol's diamond dust shadow paintings, stodgy and monochromes with glittery surfaces. Warhol channeled camp's aesthetic maximalism into a kind of scintillating minimalism, and he channeled camp's often encrypted critiques of heteronormativity, of received good taste, of bourgeois industriousness, etc., into his own work, much of which seems quite transparent at first glance, but upon scrutiny seems to reverse itself like an optical illusion revealing bottomless depths. Transgression is a word that rings somewhat hollow today because everyone has been aware for decades that we're caught in this dynamic whereby all dissent is instantly commodified. One of Artforum's contributors described Warhol's role in this development in a 2012 essay. Quote, "In 1975, armed with an Enlightenment belief in the unstoppable progress of institutional critique, I, for one, considered Warhol's notion of business art to be a brilliantly conceived parody of the side effects of an ever-expanding art world, a travesty in the manner of Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal. Little did I imagine that a quarter century later, it would have become impossible for Warhol's prognostic vision to be mistaken for travesty anymore. Warhol had, in fact, prophesied what we finally came to experience, the total permeation of the cultural sphere by the economic operations of finance capital and its attendant ethos and social structures. It was not until the early 80s or even later that it dawned on some of us that Warhol's prognostics were about to attain the status of all-encompassing and seemingly insurmountable new realities, unquote. Walking to the Whitney through a hyper-gentrified neighborhood, it's hard to escape the feeling that these are indeed insurmountable realities. I don't have any ultimately redemptive conclusion to, to counter the charge that Warhol helped to create the realities he predicted, much less to cast a flattering light on the ways in which he was dispiritingly very much of his time. For instance, when he called the violent repression of a peaceful civil rights demonstration a race riot. Still, in tension with what Benjamin Buchloh in the 2012 essay just quoted and elsewhere has identified as the affirmative dimension of Warhol's art, there's also his art's negative dimension, which is so apparent in the current exhibition. Death's heads, guns, electric chairs, car crashes, the Kennedy assassination, the nihilism of normative masculinity, the libidinal equivalence of sex and violence, alternately comical and frightening refusals of abstract expressionism, of expression itself, of affect, and of modernity's demands for affect. Films that intensify the boredom we go to the movies hoping to escape and transform it into something perversely sublime. Wall power produced by pissing on metallic paint. The complexity of Warhol's work ultimately defies the question of whether he was critical or complicit. And it's that inexhaustible complexity that means his work will be inexhaustibly generative. He embraced and performed insurmountable realities, but he also left us some of the most revealing and potent X-rays of those realities. It's important to remember, and when you look at the work, it's easy to remember all the ways in which Warhol's art went against the grain of its time, all of the received ideas it pissed on, all of the things it did not affirm, all the ways in which, when Andy said yes, he meant no. Thank you.
These, they're on, yes?
Hello.
So we're going to converse among ourselves, especially my four brilliant panelists. So many things that each of you said raised so many ideas in my mind that I feel quite confused. But, but I thought one thing that was interesting, and you use this idea of whether he's complicit or critical. And I thought that in each of your presentations, that question of criticality versus complicity was somehow could be brought out in each. I was very interested in the question of transference in Justine's presentation. First, the girlfriend whose mother looked like Warhol, and then the way in which Leigh talked about a kind of psychoanalytic relationship that Warhol set up in the factory of the kind of a management of production and personality. And in Cy's talk, the concept from the very beginning of the shadow and how it's created, but also it seemed to me Warhol as a shadow himself and why he would make shadows. That magnificent in all the different hues. And of course, then you are working with how do you create something that would be more akin to your own skin color, in that it will be seen in a specific way, in a specific time, at certain hours or not. Anyway, I was reading it that way. And then Elizabeth's thought pattern around Warhol's radicalism. And that was really interesting to me because so many things are said to be Warholian, which are not Warholian, in that they are derivative of Warhol. And therefore, the radicality that Elizabeth was talking about is lacking. So there's much more that I was thinking about in relationship to their 4 presentations, but I wondered how you responded to each other, if any one of you wants to go first in talking about what ideas were presented that interested you.
Well, I'm still reeling at the fact that, that I didn't know that Valerie Solanas and Edie Sedgwick were roommates in the same mental institution.
Can people hear her? Okay.
That's just an aside. I just had to say that. I've been reeling about that incredible fact.
It's there was this really brief period of time. I went into this wormhole of research, and I was actually regretting when I came in here that I did not research Warhol. But what's very strange is that, the criminally insane and psychiatric patients are usually kept in separate facilities, but this particular hospital, which is very close to Dia Beacon, had this one period of time where everyone was housed together. It was like there was this kind of snafu of and that was part of why it closed too. That there was all these programs. She'd be in a drug rehabilitation program, but would also receive shock therapy for that. But yeah, no, it's a strange. I was from the Brienne Foz biography, which is a really amazing read.
Of Solanas.
Of Solanas, yeah. That's where I got that information. And then I researched a little bit about the place, the Mattawan.
Fascinating.
But yeah, that's an aside. Maybe I can pick up on some of the things that Lynn was saying, because I'm also still kind of reeling from the kind of the different places that we took it, and I was trying to write down notes, what everyone was talking about to keep track of it. And for Leigh, I had written down that Andy was an empty container that was also a machine that regulates sociability. But now I kind of got so lost in what you were saying, so I actually wanted to hear more about the way that the bag or the container can control the society or the sociability. But that was for you. And then Cy, your question I had written down. I was really intrigued by your definition of shadows as a thing that reifies an object, but also falls on something else and brings a definition to the thing that it falls on. And it was such a different thinking about shadow than later on when you were talking about race, to think about shadow both as this kind of physical object of light as opposed to a kind of thinking about the way that Black Americans have been used as a background to foreground white experience. So that was for you. And then Liz, I didn't write anything for you, but I'll think of something for you.
But Leigh, would you want to talk a little bit about the idea of Warhol as a container?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about it in relationship to that psychological model that I've been interested in investigating in my work. And one thing that does is it conceives of the group as a kind of collective ego where each member of the group is a part object of that ego. And so the idea is that each member holds something specifically on behalf of the group or is positioned by the group in a specific way, and that we, in effect, use others to play out dynamics and take up functions inside the sort of ego of the social. So I think in terms of Warhol's kind of emptiness and what he kind of elicits from a viewer, and I think about this in a series like the Disaster series. You are kind of caught, sort of immersed in between this, or it sort of amidst this like really traumatic place, which is a kind of history and genealogy of almost like American trauma in a way. All these dysfunctional dynamics, race divides, kind of death drive that's coming out of World War II, and then commerce, and even the banality of commerce as it's tied into that, and all of this stuff. So it's kind of, I don't know, I sort of started thinking about how he creates this immense space to kind of fill up with projection in a way that's really unique, I think.
It is, and I was thinking about Valerie Solanas and Edie Sedgwick as people who filled that space, projected into that space, really had tremendous, we could talk about a transference to Warhol. And I was thinking about how, and if there was any other artist who caused this kind of response. I've been thinking about it before. What is it about him? And I think this notion of the empty screen, the person who doesn't speak, or who says yes when he means no and no when he means yes, can so easily become that negative place, a very negative place, also for those projections.
Wait, can I say something more? I feel like I'm hogging. But this was my thing. It ties to what you're saying, Lynn, but the thing about Valerie Solanas, this is with the Warhol idea of, prophesizing and making the mass commodification. She had this idea of unwork, where she was encouraging women to go into the workforce and do a bad job and to like break the machine and to like, to mess things up. But there was something really important in doing that's highlights how important women were actually to this kind of industrialization at that time in the 60s, joining the workforce, and it was a kind of an important, the lowest economic run, there needs to be someone there, so it would have been a really powerful tool of, but also that Valerie Solanas is Warhol's shadow self. I was trying to get at that a little bit. I didn't go into it far, but it's like, I do feel like there is some ways that his idea of the factory and his workers and her idea of unwork, or, his idea of production and her idea of she wanted to automate everything also as a way to free women from the labor essentially of reproduction, but also from economic models as well.
I guess I'm balking a little bit at the equivalency of Solanas and Warhol, but
I know it's fair. It's okay. You should, yes, please do.
I wanted to think a little bit about his films. Leigh, you spoke a little bit about his films, and some people believe that they're the most important part of Warhol's work, and of course some people don't, and they are in some ways probably the least seen of his work because of the factor of time and availability and so on, and you know, if you see them on video and not 16 millimeter and so on. And I wanted to talk about the way in which repetition is related to trauma. And so that's one part of what he does in his series of things, and repetition of the shadow in different hues. And I was thinking about in film how he works with stasis as compared with repetition. So that's about duration. And I'm just throwing that out because it's about, with Cy, you were talking about looking and watching and seeing something. How do we see better? And he seemed to think in film that it needed to go on and on and on. The early films, Empire and Sleep. And yet, what he brought into what we mostly think about is the repetition of images in whether it's the Coke bottle or the Marilyns or Elvis. And I just wondered if that created any ideas for you.
I mean, I had never thought about his repetition in terms of trauma before. I think that's a really interesting connection. I mean, in terms of the connections to the films, every time I look at the screen tests, as I had an opportunity to do in this show, I'm sort of freshly struck by how hard it is to confront I find it very kind of challenging to confront the subjects of the screen tests in a way that is simply not the case with painted portraits at all. It's like a staring contest or a confrontation of some kind, and it's almost like you're looking in a mirror at the people, like you become their reflection in a strange way, and I think maybe there's some connection there. I mean, the idea of dissociation comes to mind in terms of how trauma might kind of leave its signature on Warhol's work, and there's something about the screen test that almost has a quality of dissociation. I'm just kind of free associating, but.
Do you mean that the person being filmed might go into a dissociative state, or that we who look at it might begin to feel some kind of dissociation?
I think almost more the latter. Almost like you're, almost like what's being dramatized is like the splitting of a person, like the splitting of a consciousness kind of in two, or.
That splitting's interesting too. I mean, I see it in the repetition and how it functions in that disaster series. If you think about almost, what that's dealing with is a sort of social body in a way, and different facets of the social body, different issues that come up in the social body. So, everything from sexuality to gender to race to all sorts of things are kind of a matrix that you're affected by in there, and there seem to be, he's channeling the media, which, if you remember, a lot of that's pulled from venues like Life magazine that everybody would have received at that time, and which was mediated and received privately almost in the same way that we receive information through social media today. So it feels like the repetition for me is almost about siloing off in some way, or bringing it back and representing a kind of social through which we understand that there are many different kind of simultaneous interpretations and positions in relationship to the same image.
Something that I thought about is when you sit to have your portrait painted, you are doing what the sitters in Warhol's film stills do, but you're not self-conscious in that same way. It's a curious thing. I've had I don't know if it's an opportunity, but I have had some portraits painted of me, and you just sit, and you don't feel that same self-consciousness that you see in Warhol's sitters. So it's really interesting that he chose to make portraits like that, apart from the other portraits that he did?
Yeah, I think that dovetails with sort of what I was thinking about with representation and having agency to do that. Obviously with photographs, there's an expectation that there's some part of it that is, even now, a record of something. You know, even though we know people have the ability to put filters on their phones and change things and mark them up. But actually seeing someone before you, how they behave in a way that is irretrievable because the frame is gone now and somebody can't change it and it doesn't have the sort of public expectation of being something contrived. You know, it's really, I feel the same way, but I also feel like what you were talking about before, this sort of reversal where the discomfort of watching those people is sort of the art. I mean, I feel that way even with like Empire or something. You know, it's like, yeah, I mean, it's an accessible venue. You could see it if you wanted to, and you could look at it for that long if you really wanted to. But actually, like, putting yourself in the position that was presented to you to do is, not many people are up to that.
So do you see a parallel between the way you strive to create a situation where the work is not autonomous and the onlooker completes the experience of the work? Is there a parallel between that and what's happening in the screen tests?
I mean, I tell people. So I think it's like, if it were a secret, maybe. But I think feeling that there is something to do, maybe it's maybe more akin to like VR or something. You know, where it's private, and I think those experiences are private, but they're within your mind in a different way. Viewing those films.
Mm-hmm.
For me, there's also something like indelible about the film where you're put on the spot and you're forced to have this kind of encounter, and it's recorded and it has this sort of pressure cooker quality to it. And it's really, it's something like about how the anxiety of what you called stasis, what that produces.
Justine?
Yes, hi.
Yes. You've taken many portraits.
I have.
And you photograph people often, in the highway kind, for instance, your trip across America. And are you interested in making your subjects comfortable?
Yeah, I mean, I am. But I was thinking about when you guys were talking about the thing about a photograph, what's interesting is when I'm looking, I mean, I have a 4x5 camera, so I'm not looking through, I'm just watching the person to the side of my camera, but you're basically watching that same Warholian film, you know, and then the person doesn't really know what moment you're going to take, and they don't really know how you're going to frame them in the picture. So there's always this lopsided, like someone can agree to be in the picture, but they don't really understand how you're representing them, you know? So I guess there's something kind of, even if it's discomforting to the sitter to be aware of themselves being filmed, that there's at least they can, you know, have some control of how they're presenting differently, I think, than the single photograph where, you know, the famous Diane Arbus contact sheet where the child is perfectly lovely until the last frame where he looks like a psychopath holding a bomb. You know, like and that was the one that she chooses, so.
I guess, I don't know what time it is, but, and, yeah, should we, yes, open to questions.
Okay. Well, these are all just so extraordinary to listen to. I feel like, oh, God, we got to do another show. So I don't know what to say, but I'm not going there. I guess my question has to do with this idea of agency, which came up a lot. So there's the making side of it, right, where, you know, particularly the 60s. I mean, I really feel one has to separate out a bit the 60s and then the 70s and the 80s, which are quite different in terms of how Warhol operated. But this idea that in a way, when it's, you know, Miss Warhol or Warhol's inscrutability about what does it mean, he does throw a lot back onto the viewer, which is inevitably what every work of art sort of does. And so can we see that as a positive, to the extent that, I mean, to me, the Rorschach paintings crystallize it in many ways because they make clear, it's like, well, it's up to you kind of situation in the way that Warhol does it, both as a kind of send-up, but at the same time, also something, he always has things that are so simple, but yet they're kind of profound at the same time. So what is it about agency in Warhol? I guess that's the question. Like, where do we see that falling? Is there a positive, a negative? What's the take on that one? The amazing amount of agency that he actually throws back onto the viewer.
I mean, as a child, that was what I found so compelling about it. I thought it was like a playground, and you could talk about it with someone and have an interesting conversation about how you completed that puzzle. And that, to me, seemed like a really dynamic and interesting place for art to inhabit, which absolves the person who's making it, of course, of having some kind of dogma. But it also can create a space that's interesting and has potential that is kind of akin to just how like living is,
Is it an abdication though, when you said about the person having dogma, or?
It feels to me like it.
The intentionality issue. I guess we get back to the intention of the artist and this question of which is always the question with Warhol: is it a critique? Is it a celebration? And he kind of leaves it up to the viewer at the end of the day, or the critic, or whatever, to kind of answer that question, which to me feels like a level of honesty. I mean, it's also wildly manipulative at the same time, right? Yeah. So does it matter whether we feel he's ethical, moral? Like, where does that come into it all? Which is, when you mention Picasso and how he treated women, and this is an interesting issue I've been thinking a lot about. Like, what is the role of the artist in terms of their relationship to their work, and to the values that's being expressed? And Warhol, I don't want to say a neutrality, because I don't believe that. I believe all of who Warhol was as a working class gay guy from Pittsburgh, Catholic. Like, to me, there's a lot of personal expression in Warhol's work. You just have to search around for it. Yeah. But I do think it's there. I don't know what that's not necessarily a position or an ideology. It's just a kind of, it's more biography or hagiography.
But isn't, I'm sorry, go ahead. But isn't that different from agency, though? His ethical positions might not affect one's relationship to the work. They could, but that would depend upon the viewer also, and whether that becomes an important aspect of how you look at work. I think for me, in terms of agency, the thing is maybe very simple to say was when I first encountered that work and I saw, let's say, the soup cans or the multiples, it allowed me to think my own thoughts about making the familiar unfamiliar. And if that's agency, then I was experiencing how so-called common objects not only could be art, but that the way in which I was seeing the world had been very limited.
I think about it too in terms of, it's 3 decades since he's passed, and the work is still being enacted. In a sense, I see him almost as a kind of like X variable that's sounding out the Y of the context. And he keeps pushing at it, and we keep saying more and more and more about who we are in relationship to him. And I think that it's an interesting thing because it provides a stage through which we continue to reveal things about ourselves because of the vacuity of the kind of container he's set up.
I just wanted to go back to the screen test for a second, and it strikes me that that much of what Warhol's work hinges on is actually a kind of material preciousness, that having 4 minutes of film devoted to you in the mid-'60s meant a very different thing than having 4 minutes of video devoted to you now means. And I think that the thing that Warhol didn't predict was our current condition where screens are ubiquitous, where the ability to broadcast is almost imposed rather than reserved for those with great amounts of capital. And I think that there's a kind of lavishness in his use of film that is really paired to the predominance of things like gold in the early work, gold leaf, and these signs of affluence and kind of power that didn't register once video predominated. And I think that he never really made satisfactory work, to me at least, in video, in part because it's so promiscuous rather than precious.
He did come much more out of film than video, but he did as soon as the video stuff was available. They did bring one into the factory. But you're right, he didn't work with it very much at all, hardly at all. Did he? No.
Presumably Jack Smith was very angry, really resented the fact that Warhol, had, presumably Jack Smith was very angry that, Warhol could have this sort of very lavish use of all this, endless running of reels where he was really scraping together to be able to make film. So it's a very provocative statement you've made. It's really interesting to think about like how this all registers today. And I think the videos, for the most part, are really the factory diaries, I would say, right? I mean, that's really pretty much...
Yeah. Factory diaries.
The factory diaries, which were started in 1970 and are, they're very diaristic accounts of, like David Bowie showing up we have some in the show here, showing up at the factory, or Warhol making a painting, and they were set up to be a kind of beat the clock, like you had a 30-minute tape, and then what could you do in 30 minutes? The one I still find the most moving is the one on this floor here, the third floor of his mother. And Warhol's the cameraman, and it's just his mother lying in bed with her kerchief on. Eventually she eats a sandwich. They speak in Czech. It's just, to me, one of the most intimate, I would say, right, portrayals. But I agree that the complex work is really in film.
I just this is an appreciation of, is that A.A. Bronson in front of me? I don't know if the notion of, sorry, no, I can't see, all I see is the beard from the back. Sorry.
Naylin.
No, but of the gold. I mean,
Naylin Blake.
Oh, thank you, Naylin. Sorry. I'm just absorbing Naylin's comment on the luxury, the preciousness. But I was going to go back to the position of Warhol, how we judge morally, ethically, whatever, responding in part to Donna and to Leigh. I'm going to bring up something I said at a symposium before, but I think the idea, given to me by another artist, the idea that Warhol cultivated a position of indifference in the work, and that you separate the life from the work. I mean, Warhol introduces the overlap of art-life in the most complex way. But to the extent that what we're left with is the work, and that notion of a critical position of indifference in the work, and what responsibility that puts on the viewer. It's not just the idea of the viewer completing the work, but a moral responsibility, an ethical responsibility on the viewer, which is incredibly uncomfortable. And it's so different from the idea that you judge the moral behavior of the artist. or a position that they say through intention that they take, or want to be identified with through content, that's a reprieve for the viewer. That gets the viewer off the hook, because if you identify with a position that you think is good or right, then the art can affirm something in you. Warhol doesn't let you do that, and I think, to me, that's still part of what's so radical, and that's separate from expression or intimacy.
I think that's very interesting. And I'm trying to think about other artists and whether that kind of complexity is presented by their work, where you stand in front of it. Maybe, thinking about, I'm forgetting his name, it was here, actually, at the Whitney in the biennial, where he's beating himself up, or...
Jordan Wolfson?
Jordan Wolfson. I chose not to look at it. I didn't want to watch that. And I'm thinking about Bob Flanagan when he used to put a nail through his penis, and other work. What are you watching? What are you looking at?
Mike Kelly.
Mike Kelly, yeah.
For me, it comes up in Okwi Enwezor text that's in the catalog, where he's talking about Georges Didi Huberman and these Holocaust photographs that were shown, and the kind of the complications around the reception of those images. On one hand, Huberman being critiqued because to show those images and to deal with the evidentiary capacity of the photograph amounted to almost a type of like Holocaust denial to certain people, which was really, really complicated. But that essay is really interesting also because it seems to run as a sort of analogy to what happened in the last Whitney Biennial with the Dana Schutz painting. So.
Yeah, and to that end, I think that it's also valuable to maybe think about existing after Warhol and then having that incredulousness be like something you should keep. Like maybe don't believe an artist. I don't. I know too many to believe them. I think that kind of complexity requires you to complete it anyway. As a viewer, you have to do that anyway. I wouldn't take someone's word for it. It's their job.
I want to thank this magnificent, fascinating panel. I knew they would be great, I have to tell you. And thank all of you for coming and being such a great audience and listening. And good night.
Thanks.